Hey, what's happening, guys? If you're looking for a fast-paced, powerful rogue build, you guys are gonna love this. Using our imbuements and high mobility, we're able to strike quick, shredding through AoE packs, while still being able to bring through insane single target. Let's get into it. Starting off with our first node being Puncture, no surprise there, as this gives us our first layer of vulnerability. For our core ability, we're gonna be going with the classic Twisting Blades, and you're gonna max out these ranks to make it as strong as possible, as well as incorporate any pieces of gear that helps you bump up these ranks. We're also going to be taking enhanced twisting blades as well as advanced twisting blades, making it so that your active cooldowns are reduced by 0.10 seconds per enemy it passes through. And what makes advanced twisting blades so unique is that we're not going to be running any ultimate in this build. So we're going to have multiple options of short cooldown burst windows. And since we're not waiting a full minute for our ultimate to be coming back online, this 0.10 seconds per enemy passed is going to give us a lot more value because our cooldowns are so short. The passives we're going to be taking under the core abilities is going to be Sturdy for an extra 12% damage reduction alongside Siphoning Strikes, making it so critical strikes against close enemies have an 85% chance to heal you for 3% of your maximum life. Moving down the tree for our insane mobility in this build, we're going to be using Shadow Step and we're going to grab Dash as well. Now you're only going to need 1 point in each, but more importantly, going down the tree, we're going to be taking Enhanced Shadow Step alongside Methodical Shadow Step, granting you a stun once you use Shadow Step on that specific enemy. Moving into Dash, we're going to be heading down the tree to enhance Dash. Damaging any enemies with Dash is going to increase the critical strike damage by 15% with Discipline Dash, which is now adding not only a slow into the mix, but dazing enemies as well. And anyone that's already been slowed is now going to be dazed for 2 seconds instead. So this means this build is touching 4 different damage multipliers before we even get through half this talent tree. We're able to produce vulnerable, we're slowing enemies, we're dazing enemies, and moving into the passive nodes before we leave this cluster, we're going to have knockdown enemies as well. Now, before we move on to the passive nodes, I do use and highly recommend using a specific legendary that's granting you an extra charge of Shadow Step. And we'll go deeper into that later on in the video when I start covering all the legendaries. But with that legendary in mind, you're going to have 2 dashes, 2 Shadow Steps, so you're going to have exceptional mobility. And as we know, Shadow Step is going to be our main source of unstoppable in this build. Just the movement speed and agility by itself is insane, but now knowing you're going to have 2 charges of unstoppable on top of everything else going on is just a fantastic additive, and it takes it that step further to round out this build. Moving on to the passives in this cluster, we're going to put 3 out of 3 in Weapon Mastery, making it so our swords get a nice damage buff. And then we're going to take Rapid Gambits, making it so that your evade cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds when you daze an enemy, which is going to be all the time because we're always dashing. But that's not even the main piece of the puzzle. That's just allowing us to drop down to trick attacks, making it so when you critically strike a dazed enemy, they're now knocked down for 0.5 seconds. And this is leading us to, most importantly, concussive. After knocking back or knocking down an enemy, you gain 12% increased critical strike damage against them for additional 5 seconds. Moving on from that, you're going to put 3 out of 3 in Exploit, making it so we deal 18% increased damage to healthy and injured enemies. So straight damage increase. I would also suggest taking 3 out of 3 in Malice, making it so you deal 9% increased damage to all vulnerable enemies, which is going to be insane because we're going to have vulnerable spread out to everything super quick in this build. I'm fortunate enough to have a piece of gear giving me the 3 ranks of Malice, freeing up a few points elsewhere. Now, something I do suggest and is a possibility to switch out if you're looking for a bit more survivability and you're in a specific part of the game where you're just transitioning to World Tier 4 or wherever you're at, I do highly recommend swapping out Dash with Dark Shroud, as this is going to give you an insanely powerful defensive while increasing your movement speed, which is giving you some extra uncalculable damage reduction. And not only is this a fantastic defensive ability for rogues, you can also apply a legendary that makes it so every time a shadow is consumed, that shadow will explode, giving this solid defensive some offensive properties as well. And by the way, if you guys are enjoying these videos, feel free to hit the like button for me. It lets me know that you're enjoying these builds and maybe potentially trying them out for yourself. Thank you so much. Now moving into the main juice of this build, all of our imbuement skills. So we're going to have Shadow Imbuement and Cold Imbuement. Now, I highly recommend you only put about 1 or 2 points into these. Go through the rest of your tree, see if there's any additional passives you like to pick up, and then any points you have left over, you can start adding that back into Shadow Imbuement and Cold Imbuement. I'm sitting at 4 out of 5 in both of these, just because we have some gear contributing to these ranks. You're going to be taking Enhanced Shadow Imbuement, making it so you have a 15% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies affected by that shadow. But most importantly, blended shadow imbuement, allowing your primary target to explode, and this is going to be chaining to everything around it, making all enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. So with this ability alone, you're going to be able to blanket the entire area with vulnerability, and it's going to clear your entire screen real quick as you're going to watch all these enemies start popping off. Now, before we get into the cold imbuement, we're also going to be taking Shadow Crash. You're only going to put 1 point out of this, as this gives us a 10% chance to stun our enemies for 0.5 seconds. But the main reason why we're taking this is to gain access to consuming shadows, as each time you kill an enemy with shadow damage, you generate 10 energy. So this is absolutely key for this build, as it's going to be able to cycle you through both imbuements without having any downtime. So as you set up a big damage opener with a pack full of mobs, you'll be able to shred through them using your first imbuement, making everything vulnerable. And once everything starts falling over from that shadow imbuement, you're going to then be able to recycle all that energy to prep you for your next go with cold imbuement. So cold imbuement has a 40% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds when you take enhanced cold imbuement. On top of that, we're going to go down the tree to blended cold imbuement, making it so critical strikes with cold skills has a 20% chance to instantly freeze the target for 3 seconds. And I'm telling you right now, against any single target or AoE packs that are close together, especially if you're using that Twisting Blade legendary that allows your blades to orbit around you for a few seconds, you're pretty much guaranteed to start freezing all these enemies. And this is walking us into Frigid Finesse, allowing you to deal 15% increased damage to any chilled enemies, and the bonus is increased to 30% against any frozen enemies. So this is another way that we're adding another slow to this build. And on top of that, we're grabbing another damage bucket to throw into the mix, because now we're gaining even more amplified damage from not only frozen enemies, but slowed enemies as well. Last thing in this cluster, we're going to be maxing out Precision Imbuement, making it so our imbued skills are dealing 9% increased critical strike damage. And since we're using 2 of them, it's going to be well worth. Not only that, but I have to mention, we have some amazing synergy here, because not only does this allow us to obliterate large packs of mobs, but speaking of single target, since we're taking the Shadow Step node that allows us to stun enemies for 2 seconds, you're going to be able to lock down any hefty single target enemy that's taking a little bit longer to drop. So you'll be able to use your cold imbuement, freeze him for an extended period of time, gaining your damage amplifiers from while you're vulnerable, gaining additional damage amplifiers because he's frozen for an extra 30%. Even without all of that, the enemy's going to be locked down for such a long period of time. Once he breaks out of that freeze, if he's still alive, you now have an option to lock the enemy down even further because of the legendary that's giving us 2 charges of Shadow Step, and both of those charges are going to be stunning that enemy down for an additional 2 seconds. And that's what I found makes this build fantastic, is you're able to chew right through AoE packs, and when it comes to single target, you have a very structured way to reduce the damage on yourself and to increase your damage potential going out into that single target. Very fun way to play the game, and to have all these options to lock down a specific enemy for such a long time is a blast to play. Moving on from that, the last couple of passives we're going to be snagging up is going to be 1 point in Innervation, making it so we have a 10% chance to gain an additional 10 energy, and this is just a setup so we can mainly unlock Second Wind. Every 100 energy spent grants you 15% lucky hit chance for 5 seconds. This is always a banger to grab for any rogue build if you could spare the points. I also went down and took 1 point into Adrenaline Rush. While moving, you gain 5% increased energy. We're always moving. Alongside Haste, while above 50% energy, we gain 5% increased movement speed, and then while below 50% energy, we gain 5% increased attack speed. So on both sides of the spectrum, a very welcome buff to the build. Last up for our key passives, we're going to be taking Momentum. Now this could be switched to close quarters combat, and I do highly recommend this if you're looking for just that extra damage reduction, if you're walking into higher end content, or even if you're just finding yourself having some survivability issues. This will come into play nicely for you, making it so that your cutthroat skills gain stacks of momentum if you either hit a stunned, dazed, or frozen enemy. Also, if you hit an enemy from behind, and since we have 2 charges of Shadow Step, that's going to be happening more often than not. Now, while at 3 stacks of momentum, you're going to be gaining increased damage reduction, increased energy regeneration, and increased movement speed. You can't beat this. This is an all-around wonderful passive. Now, if you don't give a shit about survivability, I would highly recommend close quarters combat for this build. Damaging a close enemy with cutthroat skills gain a 10% increased attack speed bonus for 8 seconds. Okay. And while that's active, you're going to deal 30% increased damage against crowd-controlled enemies, which is going to be all day, every pack. Now, let's talk about some of the legendaries we're going to be using to really round out this build and make it what it is. Let's get into it. Starting off off with number 1 being our cheats aspect. Since I was having survivability problems, once I made the change to go all out with defensives, it really made a night and day difference, and I highly recommend this one, allowing you to take up to 25% less damage from crowd controlled enemies, and whenever a crowd control enemy hits you, you're going to gain a 15% movement speed buff for 2 seconds. And this is actually the first time I got to use this one, and I feel like it's really pulling through, especially considering the fact that everything we touch is going to be crowd controlled one way or another. Up next is going to be the classic disobedience aspect. Putting this on our chest piece, this and the protector aspect are definitely 2 of the best and belong to be a highlight in any build. For our boots, we're going to be having the Ravengers aspect, and this is absolutely clutch. You guys got to try this out if you haven't before. Adding an additional charge of Shadow Step really amplifies the mobility in this build, and you can't go wrong in any build with 2 options of unstoppable sitting at your fingertips. For our 2-handed weapon, our bow, obviously we're going to be going with the classic Blade Dancers aspect, and this is huge because if your initial couple strikes don't freeze the enemy, if you stay on top of the target, which sometimes isn't the best idea, but if you do decide to stay in melee range of that target, the orbiting blades that will be frost imbued are going to hit those targets as well, making damn sure that that target or targets are going to all be frozen. Followed up by that, on our neck piece, I did decide to go defensive, so I did end up putting the aspect of the protector here on the amulet. We have a decent row absorbing up to 6,000 damage, and this is going to be amplified further due to this neck piece slot. For one of my rings, we're going to be using the unstable imbuement aspect. Now, I found this one very interesting, and it plays a pretty big part in this build, making it so while you cast your imbuement ability, you're going to trigger an explosion around yourself, applying that imbuement effect, dealing nice damage, but more importantly, being able to set off or ignite our next legendary, which is going to be the Icy Alchemist legendary. This is something I tried out and I couldn't go back once I started playing with it, and this is making it so damaging a chilled or frozen enemy with a shadow imbuement skill has a 75% chance to release an additional explosion, dealing a shit ton of damage depending on your row to that specific target and everything surrounding it. Not only that, but it's going to be an additional chilling effect for 25%. So when you're using twisting blades, I found it that there's a bit of a delay until shit starts popping off because you're waiting for those blades to come back, right? Well, now you have a way to essentially ignite this explosion process as soon as you're ready for it. So if you walk into a pack of mobs and you use your cold imbuement, now you can simply press your shadow imbuement. This is going to trigger a shadow explosion because of your imbuement aspect that is now going to set off the chain reaction of explosions from your shadow and your frost imbuement. Having these 2 legendaries together allows this build to be a precise time bomb. Now you don't always have to wait for those dancing blades to come back to you. You can now set that off whenever you're ready. But for our second ring, we're going to be using the Edge Master's Loop. This is an absolute banger when it comes to this build, and majority of rogue builds at that, increasing the damage based on your available primary resource when cast. And since the specialization that we're going to be going with is Inner Sight, making it so that when you attack specific enemies, you're going to gain unlimited energy for 4 seconds, which is synergizing super well with this legendary, because now you can look at it as not only are you replenishing your energy because of a lot of the passive talents that we're taking, we're replenishing energy while we're moving, we're replenishing energy when we're using our shadow imbuement ability. That alone is going to be fantastic. But now when your Inner Sight procs, you're going to be sitting at 100% energy for at least 4 seconds, spamming your main core twisting blade ability. So this has insane uptime. You really want it, close to need it, go get it. And last up for our legendaries, we're going to have the aspect of corruption, making our imbuement skills have a 36% increased potency against vulnerable targets, which is essentially everything all the time. Now in a second, we're going to get into our Paragon board, where we're going to be increasing the potency of our imbuements even further. So this is going to be stacking up on top of that, really feeding into that imbuement potency. And some questions to shout out to you guys. How has your leveling nightmare grind been treating you? What classes are you running? What builds are you running? And what would you suggest me try next? Or let me know if you guys are trying to see something specific. I really enjoy making thematic class builds, so if something crosses your mind, please let me know. I'd love to talk about it. Now let's get back into it and start talking about some stats. So main stats to be on the lookout for. Obviously, always be on the lookout for maximum life, damage reduction, total armor, stuff to help you survive. It's always key. We're mainly going to be going with dexterity where you could find it. But for our gloves, definitely look for some additional ranks in twisting blades. It's going to be key. Critical strike damage with imbuement skills is going to be extremely extremely nice considering we're rocking 2 of them. Energy cost reduction's always a nice additive to be thrown into the build. And at this point, to each its own. We have so many options in this build. Damaging to stun enemies works. Damage to froze enemies works. Damage to chill enemies, go crazy. Look for ranks of imbuement skill. Look for vulnerable damage. Obviously, critical strike damage is always nice. Damage to close, damage to injured, damage to healthy, damage to crowd control enemies, considering we're always crowd controlling every time we step into a pack. And we can even start dabbling into damage to dazed enemies. And you just can't leave out damage to core abilities either. So we have so much to pick from because we have so much variety in this build. So go crazy with that. And with that, let's jump into our Paragon board. So there is a glyph that I need to swap out, but we'll discuss that after we go through the board here. So right off the bat, I started off at the right hand side here to grab Prime. Extra 20% damage is always nice, and I grabbed all these nodes along the way. Heading up to our first glyph socket, I chose Closer, making it so that every 5 dexterity purchased within range allows your Cutthroat skill to deal 5% increased damage. Also, making it so while wielding a melee weapon, you take 10% reduced damage. Now from here, I came over to the left hand side to grab Skillful, again giving us a little damage buff, and I grabbed these nodes along the way. But I did want the additional armor nodes, so I chose to go to the right hand side just to pick up these additional armor stats. And with Lawless, not only are you gaining an extra 200% armor, but this is giving you 10 dexterity, which is still in range of this glyph socket. So that this way it's giving you an additional 10% dexterity, which is giving you 10% more Cutthroat skill damage. So we're going to head up from here into our next board, being Eldritch Bounty, making it so that when you attack with imbuement skills, you gain 20% resistance. But you get a 20% increased damage from that imbuement element for 9 seconds. So I started pathing over to the left hand side, gaining Potent. This is increasing your imbuement skill damage by 30 while gaining another 10 dexterity, and picking up all the roundabout nodes close by, increasing imbuement skill damage even further. Then heading up to our next glyph socket, and I'm choosing Pride, allowing us to deal an additional 13% increased physical damage to both healthy and injured enemies. Is a straight up damage increase that you can't beat. So now we're going to start pathing to the right hand side here, crossing the entire board. We're just going to pick up this rare node, Ready Supply, and picking up some of the magic nodes. Not too important, but it's giving us a bit of cooldown reduction for our imbuement skills, which is always nice. And it's going to be the quickest way to get on out of here to the next board. We're going to head straight up, and we're going to keep pathing in a diagonal to our first legendary node. As we stated before, giving us some resistance and 20% increased damage to that imbuement element. We're then going to grab our next rare node, Imbuer, increasing our imbuement skill damage by an additional 30%, with all of these roundabout nodes doing the same. And we're going to get on out of here to our next board. The next runner up is going to be Cheap Shot. This is going to allow you to deal 5% increased damage for each enemy that you have crowd controlled. And if you learned anything in this build, we're able to crowd control people like it's running out of style, so there's no short supply of that. Starting off again to the left hand side, we're going to pick up Calculated, giving us a 30% damage increase to crowd controlled enemies and 100 armor. And while we're over here, we're going to grab an additional 50 armor from both of these nodes alongside the extra damage nodes that are sitting here. We're going to continue on up to our glyph socket, and this glyph socket is going to be chipped, making it so that physical damage increases the damage enemy takes by you for 1%, and this stacks up to 10%. So as a full physical damage build, you can't really beat that. I decided to come up a little bit further since we're right by the rare node Wiles. We're going to scoop up the 12% damage reduction from slowed enemies. We have an opportunity to slow enemies from like 5 different abilities, so why not snag it? We're right nearby. And we're also going to grab these magic nodes and Devious, giving us another 30% damage bump to our damage crowd controlled enemies. From here, we're going to start pathing back down to the right hand side, getting Oppress, again boosting our crowd control damage by 30% and giving us 15% critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies. And we're going to pick up all these magic nodes, as these are all damage boosters that are sitting in this cluster. We're going to backtrack a little bit and head up, grab Cheap Shot, and then we're going to head on out to our right hand side to attach the next board. Now for our final board, we're going to be going with Exploit Weakness. Whenever you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they're going to be taking 1% increased damage from you for 6 seconds up to 15% to all of your already vulnerable enemies. Starting here, we're going to start pathing north first just to pick up this glyph socket, and I chose to put Efficiency, and this is where the options arise. I chose to put Efficiency, making it so your imbuement skills effects have 20% increased potency. Now that totally makes sense to me, as this is an imbuement build, but I highly recommend we just use Exploit. Exploit, as you guys know or didn't know, is one of the best glyphs in the game, making it so that we deal increased damage to that vulnerable target. But not only that, the passive bonus that you're gaining from this, when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable. So now with all the ways that we have an option to apply vulnerable, you could simply do a basic attack and know for a fact that you're going to be setting that off. So for you guys, I can't not recommend exploit. Find a glyph socket. I recommend this one since I'm using efficiency, and this will probably be the most lackluster that I have socketed in out of the bunch. And replace this with exploit. You guys would be all set. Since we're up top here, I pathed over to the left. I grabbed a couple potion healing nodes because it literally took me just 1 point to path over here. Why not? I also went up top here just to grab artifice, increasing our vulnerable damage alongside dexterity. And that's as high as we're going to go from there. We're going to path back down to our third rare node on this board, granting us exploit, giving us a 20% vulnerable damage increase, as well as a 25% damage increase to any injured enemies. We're going to keep pathing to the right hand side here. I did grab this 50+ armor node since we're right by it. Any armor nodes that you're swinging by, you may as well grab, especially if it's not out of the way. We're going to head up to the middle of the board and obviously grab exploit weakness, the legendary node, increasing the damage you do by an additional 15% to any vulnerable enemies. And this is pretty much as far as I've got so far. The plan to finish up this board is to head to the right hand side, head up just to grab this last rare node, Hunter Killer, as it's another absolute banger, increasing damage to elites by 8% and an additional 32% damage to elites, which in my opinion just can't be overlooked. From here, we're going to head out to attach our next board. But I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed this build. There should be some other videos popping up on screen next. Feel free to take a look at those if you're interested. Hit the like button if you'd like, subscribe if you feel like it, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.